It is not yet properly light. A gray, cold, heaving dawn off a beach in Normandy, the sea the color of old iron, and there is a small flat-fronted boat wallowing in the swell, packed to the gunwales with men, 30-odd of them, shoulder to shoulder, soaked through, most of them sick as dogs from the run-in, staring at a wall of gray water, and a strip of sand beyond that is about to become the most dangerous place on earth. And then a man at the back leans on a lever, and the whole front of the boat falls forward with a bang and drops down into the water as a ramp. And the men go, out over that front into the surf, up the beach into the war. Now I want you to look at that boat, not at the men, not at the beach, not at the noise, at the boat. Because here is the thing that took me half a lifetime to properly understand. That boat is not steel. It is very largely made of plywood, wood. It has no armor worth the name. It is cheap. It is small. It looks, honestly, like something a clever man would knock together to go duck shooting in a swamp. And on that gray morning, and on 100 mornings like it, the entire outcome of the Second World War is balanced on the front ramp of a plywood box. Because if the men can't get off the ships and onto the beaches in their thousands again and again and again, then all the battleships and all the bombers and all the grand machines in the world count for exactly nothing. The war gets won, or lost, right there on the ramp of that little wooden boat. That boat has a name, though most people have never once said it out loud. It's the LCVP landing craft, vehicle, personnel, and near enough everybody who ever crewed one or rowed one just called it the Higgins Boat, after the man who dreamed it up. And the supreme commander of the whole invasion, a fellow you may have heard of called Eisenhower, reportedly said of the man who built it that he was the man who won the war for us. A plywood boat, the man who won the war. Hold on to that, because I am going to show you, bolt by bolt, why that mad-sounding sentence might just be the truest thing anyone said about the whole business. Let me wipe my hands and say hello properly. Reg, that's me. I spent the whole of my working life as the bloke they wheeled the broken machines to. A fitter, a mechanic, a restorer of tired old military vehicles, the fellow up to his elbows in the engine bay while everybody else stood about admiring the shiny bits. And I have to tell you, this one is a joy for me, because usually I come on here to take a legend down a peg. Usually I've got a grudge. Usually there's some magnificent, overpraised, gold-plated wonder weapon that everybody worships, and my job is to show you the breakdowns and the bills that the highlight reel left out. Not today. Today it's the other way round entirely. Today I get to stand up for the little bloke, the workhorse, the cheap, ugly, humble, mass-produced thing that everybody used and nobody wrote poems about. The machine that did the actual work, while the glamour machines got the medals and the magazine covers. And of all the workhorses of that whole war, I don't think there is one I love more, or one that has been more quietly, unfairly forgotten, than this plain little plywood boat out of the swamps of Louisiana. So come on, let me show you the old girl properly, and let me show you why a New Orleans boat builder most people have never heard of has as good a claim as anyone to being the man who got the job done. And to understand the boat, you have to understand where it came from, because, and this is the part I adore, it was never designed for war at all. Not one bit of it. It started life in the swamps. There was a man in New Orleans by the name of Andrew Higgins. Andrew Jackson Higgins, to give him his full title, which tells you a bit about the man already. He wasn't a great naval architect from some grand shipyard. He was a boat builder, a lumberman, a fierce, stubborn, hard-drinking, hard-driving character who built small boats down in Louisiana. and the boats he built had one very particular job to do. They had to work the shallows, the bayous, the marshes, the swamps, the oil fields out in the wetlands where the water is measured in inches, not fathoms. His customers were oil drillers and trappers, and, if we're honest, the odd fellow running rum through the marshes during Prohibition. People who needed a boat that could go where no sensible boat could go. And so Higgins built a boat he called the Eureka. And the Eureka was a genuinely clever thing. It was designed from the keel up to run in almost no water at all, to charge straight up onto a mudbank or a sandbar or a soft shore, land whatever it was carrying, and then back itself off again into deeper water without tearing its bottom out or fouling its propeller. It had a shallow, flat, cunning hull shape, and a snub, spoon-shaped bow that could ride up over a submerged log or a sandbar rather than smashing into it. It was tough, it was simple, and it did the one thing it was built to do superbly. And there's a lovely bit of mechanical cunning tucked away underneath that I have to point out, because it's the sort of thing only a man who'd actually run boats aground for a living would bother to get right. On any ordinary boat, the propeller hangs down below the hull, and the moment you run up onto a sand or a shingle beach, that spinning propeller digs straight into the bottom, and you've wrecked it. Higgins tucked his propeller up into a recess, a sort of half-tunnel in the hull, so the flat bottom of the boat took the beach and shielded the propeller from the sand. That is why she could charge the shore at speed, land her load, and then go hard astern and drag herself back off into deep water, over and over all day, without ruining her own running gear. To you, that might sound like a footnote. To a mechanic, that little detail is the difference between a boat that lands an army once and a boat that lands an army all morning. Now, just sit with that for a second because a mechanic's ears prick up here. A boat that runs right up onto a soft shore in inches of water drops its load and reverses off undamaged. In a swamp, that's how you service an oil derrick. On a hostile coastline, that is precisely to the letter, how you land an army. The whole hard problem of amphibious war. How do you get a huge number of men and then their vehicles off the deep-water ships and onto a shallow, unprepared, defended beach? Higgins had already half-solved it years earlier for a completely different reason, chasing oil and furs through the Louisiana mud. The war didn't invent the Higgins boat. The swamp did. The war just came along and desperately, urgently needed exactly the thing this awkward man had already built. And here's a detail I love because it's so human. When the American military went looking for a boat to land troops, they mostly wanted to design their own, in-house, by committee, the proper official way. And the boats they came up with were, by most accounts, not very good. And Higgins, being Higgins, a man with an ego the size of Louisiana and a temper to match, was absolutely certain that his boat was better, and said so loudly to anyone who'd listen and plenty who'd rather he didn't. He fought the bureaucracy. He fought the committees. He was rude, he was difficult, he was impossible, and he was right. When his boats were actually tested against the official designs, out on the water, doing the real job, his won. Because of course they did. His had already been doing the real job for real customers who'd have gone bust if the boat let them down for years. That's the thing about a machine that's earned its living in the real world before anyone asked it to go to war. It arrives already honest. It's already had all the nonsense knocked out of it. But the Eureka wasn't quite the Higgins boat yet. There was one piece missing, and it's the most important piece of the whole story, so let me slow right down. On the early boats, to get out, the men had to climb over the sides. And think about what that means on a beach that's being defended. You've run all the way in through the surf, and now to get out, your soldiers have to stand up in full kit and clamber over the high wooden sides of the boat, one at a time, slow and exposed, right at the worst possible moment. It's clumsy, it's slow, and slow is the one thing you cannot afford. And a jeep or a field gun or any kind of vehicle, forget it. You can't lift a jeep over the side, so the boat could land men, badly, and vehicles not at all. And I want you to really feel how bad the alternatives were, because it's the only way to understand why the ramp mattered so much. Before landing craft like this, the accepted way to put men onto a hostile shore was for them to scramble down rope nets slung over the side of a big ship into little open boats. And then, at the beach, climb back out over the sides again, slow, clumsy, exhausting, and murderously exposed. And the other option the planners dreaded was that you'd have to capture a proper harbor, a port with docks and cranes, before you could land anything heavy at all, which meant attacking the enemy exactly where he was strongest and most expecting you. Both of those were nightmares. The ramped landing craft blew both nightmares away. It meant you could pick almost any open, gently shelving beach on the whole coast, anywhere the enemy wasn't ready, and pour an army straight onto it. That freedom, land anywhere, not just at the fortified ports, is one of the great hinges of the whole war, and it turns on a hinged wooden ramp. The fix was a bow ramp. Rebuild the front of the boat so that the whole bow is a hinged door, a heavy flat ramp that, at the touch of a lever, drops forward and down, straight onto the sand. And now, instead of clambering over the sides, everybody just runs or drives straight out over the front and onto the beach in seconds. Men, jeeps, a small gun, supplies, all of it out the front fast, and the empty boat backs off and goes to fetch the next load. That ramp is the whole thing. That ramp is what turns a clever swamp boat into the machine that lands armies. Now, where did the ramp idea come from? And here I have to be careful and honest with you, because this is exactly the sort of thing that gets simplified into a nice, clean story that isn't quite true. The commonly told version is that the ramp was inspired by photographs of Japanese landing craft. The Japanese had been running amphibious landings in China, using boats with bow ramps, and photographs of those boats reportedly made their way to the Americans, who said, in effect, put a front like that on the Higgins Boat. And there's real truth in that. But exactly how much was borrowed and how much Higgins and his people worked out themselves, that is genuinely debated, and you'll find sources that lean harder one way or the other. So let me just say it plainly. The ramp was not conjured out of nothing. The Japanese landing craft were a real influence, and the precise credit is argued over to this day. What is not in doubt is that Higgins's people took the idea, put it onto a hull that was already brilliant at running onto beaches, built the whole thing in enormous numbers, and made it work. So let's have a proper look at what you've actually got in the metal, or rather, in the wood. The Higgins boat, the LCVP, was small, about 36 feet long, call it the length of a couple of buses, no more. It was built very largely of plywood, with some steel where it counted, and that choice of wood was not a compromise or a cheapness. It was a stroke of genius, and here's why. Steel in a war is desperately precious. Every ton of it is fought over. It wants to be tanks and ships and guns and shells. By building the boat mostly of plywood, Higgins built a landing craft that barely touched the steel budget at all. He could make tens of thousands of them without stealing the steel that the tanks and the warships needed. A wooden boat in that war wasn't the poor man's choice. It was the clever man's choice. It had that shallow draft, so it could run right up the sand. It had the spoon bow and the drop ramp at the front. Down the sides, wooden sides, not much taller than a man and no real armor. I'll come back to that because it matters and it's grim. In the back, a marine engine, nothing exotic, and a little crew to run her. A coxswain at the wheel, steering the thing in through the surf and holding her steady while the ramp went down. And a handful of other men, usually 3 or 4 all told, working the ramp and the engine and a couple of light guns for a bit of cover. And she could carry on that little wooden deck about 36 fully laden soldiers, or instead 1 jeep, or a small vehicle, or a few tons of the endless unglamorous supplies, the food, the ammunition, the fuel, the everything that an army ashore devours by the hour. Men or a vehicle or cargo straight onto the beach and off again for more. That's the whole machine. That's it. There is nothing clever about it. And that plainness is the point. And now let me take you off the beach and into the place these boats came from, because this, for me, is where the story goes from good to genuinely moving. Higgins didn't build a handful of these. He built a flood of them. Down in New Orleans, Higgins Industries grew from a small boatyard into an enormous operation running around the clock, and it turned out Higgins Boats and their bigger cousins by the thousand. And the people who built them, this is the bit I want you to hear, were not some narrow set of hands. In a time and a place that was harshly, brutally divided, Higgins ran a workforce of men and women together, of all sorts of backgrounds side by side on the same line, because he cared, in his blunt way, about one thing above all else. Can you build the boat, and can you build it fast? He was famous for paying the same for the same work, which in that place at that time was close to unheard of. I'm not going to paint the man as a saint. He was a hard, difficult, complicated fellow chasing production and profit both. But the boats got built in the tens of thousands by an army of ordinary people, working flat out, who mostly never saw a beach in their lives. How many? The number usually thrown about is somewhere north of 20,000 Higgins boats and their relatives. And I have to flag, as I always do, that the exact totals wobble depending on which source you read and how you count the whole family of Higgins landing craft. But whichever number you take, it is enormous. Tens of thousands of cheap, simple, wooden boats poured out of one American city, each one of them able to land 30-odd men or a vehicle on a hostile shore. That is not a weapon. That is a tide. And think about what that flood of boats actually asks of a factory, because this is where you see the real difference between a champion and an army. A hand-built wonder weapon needs a few dozen master craftsmen and years of fiddling. A Higgins boat needed a design so plain and materials so ordinary that thousands of people who'd never built a boat in their lives could learn a small part of the job and do it, over and over, at speed, without a single one of them being a genius. That is a different kind of cleverness, and I'd argue it's the harder one. Any good engineer can design a thing that one brilliant workshop can just about build. It takes a rarer sort to design a thing that a whole city of ordinary hands can pour out by the tens of thousands and have every single one of them work. The plain little boat is not the absence of genius. It is genius pointed at the right target for once. And now let me connect it up, because this is the whole argument. And if you've seen my other videos, you'll know it's the argument I keep coming back to, because it's the truest thing I know about war and about machines and, honestly, about life. We remember the wrong things. We remember the glamour. We remember the battleships, huge and gray and magnificent, and the famous tanks and the sleek fighters. We put those on the posters and in the films. And those things mattered, of course they did. But a war is not won by the magnificent duel. A war is won by getting the men and the fuel and the food and the bullets and the boots to the right place, in the right numbers, on the right morning, and then doing it again tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, for years. War is logistics. It is the boring, grinding, unglamorous business of moving vast amounts of stuff from where it is to where it needs to be. And on the day of days, on the 6th of June, 1944, the single most important machine on the whole coast of France was not a battleship, and it was not a tank. It was a plywood box with a ramp on the front, arriving and arriving and arriving, wave after wave, unloading men and pulling off and going back for more. Think of the scale of it. The invasion of Normandy landed something on the order of 150,000 men in a single day, and a great many of them came ashore over the front ramp of a Higgins boat. And it wasn't just Normandy. Across the whole vast war in the Pacific, island after island after island, every one of those landings you've ever heard of, the men very often went in over the ramp of one of these same little boats. From the beaches of France to the far side of the world, the same humble machine, built by the tens of thousands in Louisiana, was the thing that actually delivered the war to the enemy's doorstep. Everything else, all the ships, all the planning, all the courage, all of it funneled down, at the very last and most important moment, to this. Could you get the men off the boat and onto the sand? And the answer, over and over, was yes, because of a boat builder from the swamps. Which brings us back to that sentence I dangled at the start. Eisenhower, Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme commander of the whole invasion, the man in charge of the lot, who later became President of the United States, is reported to have said, years afterwards, that Andrew Higgins was the man who won the war for us. It's a real, well-attested remark. It comes down to us through an interview the historian Stephen Ambrose recorded, and Eisenhower is said to have gone on to explain that if Higgins had not designed and built those landing craft, the whole shape of the war would have had to be different. They'd have had to fight for the ports, on ground of the enemy's choosing, and the whole strategy of landing anywhere they liked on an open beach would have been off the table. Now I want to be dead straight with you about that quote, because it's easy to swing it around like a hammer, and that's not fair to the truth. It is one man's opinion. It's a tribute, a general's warm, generous, over-the-shoulder salute to an awkward genius who'd made his job possible. Eisenhower is not standing there with a spreadsheet claiming that one boat, on its own, literally won the Second World War. That would be daft, and no serious person means it that way. Wars that size are won by millions of people and thousands of machines and rivers of blood and treasure. But when the man who commanded the greatest seaborne invasion in history looks back over all of it and reaches for the one name he wants to credit, and the name he lands on is a plywood boat builder from New Orleans and not some admiral or some famous tank, that tells you something. That tells you he understood, better than the posters do, where the war was really won. Not in the glamour, in the plywood. But I promised you honesty, and I'd be doing the men who rowed these boats a disservice if I let you walk away thinking the Higgins boat was some cozy, clever little triumph and nothing more. So let me tell you the hard side plainly, because it's part of the machine's truth. Riding one of these in was, by every account I've ever read or heard, a miserable and frightening experience. That flat-bottomed, shallow hull that was so brilliant at running onto a beach was a wallowing, slamming, pitching nightmare out in a proper sea. The boats bucked and rolled and threw spray over everyone aboard, and the men, packed in tight, soaked, keyed up out of their minds, were very often violently, helplessly seasick before they ever reached the shore, going into the worst morning of their lives already exhausted and green and shaking. And the boat had no armor to speak of. Those wooden sides would stop the weather and not a great deal else. When the ramp went down on a defended beach, the men inside were terribly exposed at exactly the moment they were most crowded together and could least get away. I'm not going to dwell on the grimness of that or dress it up. It's not that kind of channel, and it wasn't that kind of morning. But you should know it. The price of getting the army onto the beach was paid in full by the men crammed into these fragile wooden boxes. And the boat that I so admire as a piece of engineering was, for the man riding it, a cramped, cold, sick-making, unprotected place to be at the most dangerous moment of his whole life. Both of those things are true at once, and a fair man holds them both. So let me give you my verdict as a mechanic on this old girl, and it's the opposite of the verdict I usually hand out. Usually I stand here and tell you that some magnificent, complicated, hand-built wonder machine was secretly a diva that spent half the war broken down. This time, I get to tell you the happy version. The Higgins boat is what happens when engineering gets the goal exactly right. It did not try to be magnificent. It tried to be enough, and to be enough tens of thousands of times over. It was cheap, so they could build a flood of them. It was wooden, so it barely touched the precious steel. It was simple, so ordinary people could build it fast and other ordinary people could run it and fix it. It was based on a design that had already proved itself in the real world, doing a real job, before anyone asked it to be a weapon. It did one thing: get men and machines from ship to shore. And it did that one thing superbly, reliably, and by the tens of thousands, everywhere, all at once. The engineers, bless them, so often fall in love with the clever, the complicated, the beautiful. Higgins fell in love with the boat that worked. And the boat that worked is the one that won. And here's where I turn it round on you, because I didn't walk you through swamp boats and bow ramps and plywood just to settle an old argument about a war that ended long before most of us were born. I think about the Higgins boat a lot, out in the workshop, and after all these years it stopped being about boats. It's about the thing all of us get wrong our whole lives. We are dazzled by the glamour machine and we overlook the workhorse. We remember the battleship and we forget the little wooden boat that actually did the job. And it's not just history, it's you and it's me. In your own life, in your own work, there is almost certainly some quiet, humble, unglamorous thing, a habit, a person, a tool, a plain and boring routine, that is doing the real work, showing up every single day, carrying the whole thing on its ramp, while your attention is off admiring something shinier and grander that actually does far less. We give the medals to the magnificent. We should give them to the thing that shows up. The world is not, in the end, saved by the wonder weapon on the poster. It is saved by 10,000 plywood boats and the ordinary people who built them and the ordinary people who rowed them in. It always has been. So don't wait for the battleship. Back the Higgins boat. Build the plain, cheap, reliable thing you can make 1,000 of and actually keep running. Honor the workhorse in your own life, the boring thing that quietly does the job, because that, and not the glamour, is what actually gets you to the far shore. So that's my question for you, and I do read the comments, so tell me straight. What's the Higgins boat in your life? What's the humble, unglamorous, plain little thing, a tool, a habit, a person, an old reliable machine, that quietly does the real work while everybody's eyes are on something flashier? And the other way round, what's the glamour machine you fell for that turned out to do a lot less than the workhorse next to it? I genuinely want to know. Put it down below. My granddad reckoned the men who won that war weren't mostly the ones in the famous machines at all. They were the ones in the boring ones, the trucks and the boats and the supply dumps, the fellows nobody made a film about, who just kept the stuff moving. It took me most of my life to understand he was talking about more than the war. I'm off to help Stan not start Bessie again. She's a stubborn old girl, and unlike a Higgins boat, she has never once done the one thing she's supposed to do on the first try. And if you enjoyed watching an old mechanic stand up for the little wooden boat that got forgotten, then do subscribe and stick around, because I've a whole workshop of these to get through the ugly winners, the beautiful failures, the daft-looking ideas that were secretly genius. The name's Reg. Mind the mud on your way out, and next time somebody shows you a photo of a great gray battleship and calls it the machine that won the war, you smile, and you tell them about a plywood boat from a Louisiana swamp.